This is Corinne.
And this is Ayanni.
And you're listening to Sex, Love, Literature, a pop culture podcast where we take a semi-scholarly look at why
and how
the sex stuff in media matters.
This episode, we're excited to do a deep dive into the Broadway musical Hadestown, which adapts the myths of Orpheus and Eurydice and Hades and Persephone.
We get into how the musical adapts Greek mythology for a modern setting, the love stories and tragedy of the two core relationships, and the productive ambiguity of seeing it all happen on stage.
If you're a big fan of Hadestown, or if this is the first time you've ever heard about it, let us know on Instagram or Threads at SexLoveLit and on Tumblr at SexLoveLitPodcast.
Don't forget to subscribe to and rate our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of your other favorite podcast platforms.
And if you have a moment, leave us a review. It can really help convince other people to check out our show.
All right, let's dive in.
Hello, SLL listeners. Welcome to another episode of Sex, Love, Literature. As always, we are super excited to have you here with us to hang out and talk about cool stuff, pop culture.
And I am excited to be back and not be sick anymore.
Yes, it's good to have you back. I missed you. It was nice recording with Andrew, don't get me wrong, but you know, we have our dynamic. We have our back and forth. You know, I had to introduce what's sparking joy, and you just do a better job at that than me.
So a funny thing that happened with the podcast. So I haven't told you this yet, actually. So I did a mock interview with like some people that I work with, and some of them listen to the podcast. And one of them,
thank you for listening, Corinne's colleagues.
One of them in his feedback was like, I know you can be more excited than that because I have heard you be more excited than that on your podcast. And I was like, thank you, but also, ouch, I'm not sure.
Well, hold on, wait a minute. Now I need some context. What were you talking about that you were not excited enough about this thing?
It was just like the first question, so I wasn't like warmed up or into it yet.
Got it. Okay.
It was like why is this position, why are you a good fit for this position and this school? And I'm honestly kind of bad at that question because like I saw a Tumblr post recently that was like, cover letters are so dumb. Why are you asking me to write a fan fiction about working for you? And that's how I feel about answering that question.
But fan fiction is great. It's so... Oh, gosh. Well, that's hilarious. But also, like, I don't know if you should be bringing the same kind of excited energy to that question that you bring to talking about, like, Ming, right? Like,
yeah.
That'd be weird.
I need them to think I'm normal. Or like the just the right amount of weird to hire someone for like an English teaching position.
I think if you were that excited about the job, they'd be like, something's not right here.
Anyway, thanks to my colleagues, the mock interview was very helpful. But yeah.
That's funny. That's really funny to me. On that note, speaking about being excited, why don't we just launch into What's Sparking Joy? Corinne, what is What's Sparking Joy? So I don't have to do it.
So What's Sparking Joy is when we talk about something that we are currently watching, reading, or listening to that is currently sparking joy for us. So we're doing What's Sparking Joy a little bit differently because we both have so much work to do that everything we're watching, reading, or listening to has to do with either work or research or the podcast. So we're going to talk about something that we're watching, reading, or listening to for work. So, Ayanni, what about your work or research is currently sparking joy for you?
Oh, this is such a weird question.
We do like our work, we promise.
No, yeah, but it's work, so there's that work element to it. But, okay, so something about my personal work that's sparking joy for me is in April, I'm going to be teaching a class on the cartooning of Emily Carroll. So not so much like this is how you cartoon, because I am not a cartoonist myself, but it's a class with the Sequential Artist Workshop that's out of Gainesville, and we're going to be doing kind of like a read with me kind of a thing, where we're going to be going through her bibliography and kind of talking about how her work changes, evolves, how she's using horror certain ways, how she uses color certain ways. So I'm really excited to teach this class because I do really love Emily Carroll's work, and it's always fun and exciting to talk about it with folks. So I'll put a link to the course in our show notes if you'd like to sign up and read Emily Carroll with me. So yeah, Emily Carroll is sparking joy. We similarly, one of Corinne's classes, she was teaching when I arrived at the castle, which I think is one of Emily Carroll's top tier texts. And I talked with her class about it through Zoom, and that's always fun. It's a little weird because like they're far away and I'm a big head on the screen, but like I think your class had a lot of interesting things to say. They're a smart group, so that sparked joy for me.
Yeah, that was my, not my first Emily Carroll, because I've read and taught the adaptation of Laurie Halse Anderson's Speak, which Emily Carroll did the graphic novel version for. But yeah, When I Arrived at the Castle is like a whole different level of horror than Speak.
Yeah. It's a weird book, but I like it. I like it because it's weird. Yeah, and I like teaching when I don't have to do any grading, so like, you know.
Yeah, I have to do the grading part.
That's why you guest lecture, and then you run away when the essays come in.
Yeah. All right, so what's sparking joy for me in my research? I am currently working on the beginnings of a conference presentation that will hopefully turn into an article on something that I've been thinking about. So it isn't like an overflow for my dissertation, but it's something that is kind of like an offshoot for my dissertation that I noticed and wanted to pay more attention to once I had the brain space for it. And that is the depictions of sex work in young adult fantasy, which may sound counterintuitive, like having depictions of sex work in young adult literature, but the fantasy element and the fantasy space of secondary or imagined worlds, I think, makes space for them in an interesting way.
I would agree, yeah.
So I've been doing some rereading of books that have sex workers in them. So in particular, right now, I'm rereading Tamora Pierce's Beka Cooper trilogy.
Oh, yeah. Beka was in your first chapter, right?
Yeah. So in my first chapter of my dissertation, I looked at the Alanna, the Lioness, Quartet, and the Beka Cooper trilogy because they're both set in Tortal, but in that fictional world, like 300 years apart, I think.
Oh,
but Alanna was... The Alanna Quartet was Tamora Pierce's first set of books, and Beka Cooper is not her most recent, but one of her most recent quartets. Like, it was published in like from 2008 to I think like 2012 or so. And it's really fun. And yeah, Beka Cooper, I think, I don't know, hardcore Pierce fans might disagree with me, but I kind of see the Beka Cooper trilogy as kind of like Tamora Pierce's magnum opus almost. Like, she's doing the most in it. Really? Well, yeah, she's using a different format, so she's using like a first person diary format.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's building towards the like abolishment of slavery in Tortal. It's also doing a lot of the setup for like in a world in which Beka can be like, well, essentially a cop. So that's also complicated. But like in the early versions of like a peacekeeping legal force, but in like the slums of the capital. And there's also the seeds of this world in which then Alanna 300 years later, where it is impossible to imagine there being a lady knight. So it's like sort of setting up this backslide into really strict patriarchy.
Oh, Beka came before Alanna.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I'm looking at like the sex workers that are in that trilogy as part of this article that I'm dreaming up. So yeah, Beka Cooper, a fun trilogy to revisit.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you know what? That was nice. Hearing you talk about Beka Cooper sparked joy for me. So I know I kind of made a face at you when you suggested doing this for What's Sparking Joy, but like, this was nice. Thank you for suggesting.
I'm glad.
So moving on from What's Sparking Joy, today, you can't tell by the title of our episode, we are talking about the play Hadestown, which is very exciting. We have been thinking about talking about Hadestown for quite a bit now, and we kind of had to delay it. This was originally going to be our February episode, but I don't know. I'm really jazzed to talk with you about it, Corinne.
I think it was originally going to be actually our December episode.
Oh, you are absolutely right.
So we saw it. For context, when I visited Ayanni and her spouse Andrew in New Jersey in December, we went to see Hadestown on Broadway, which was super great, super fun. And then we had plans to record the next day, a special episode where we could be in the same place and record. And I got sick.
So I'm going to say we're kind of lucky that we can actually record about Hadestown today, because every time we plan to record about it,
I get
Corinne
sick.
Here, or Dr. Corinne here gets ill. So, like, I'm glad we worked that out, or that you worked that out. I'm not the one that's the problem here.
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah.
My immune system needs to get it together.
Work that shit out, man.
Anyway, we're talking about Hadestown now, finally.
Yes. So this is a play that you have kind of it's been on your mind, let's say, for a very, very long time. So do you want to tell folks a little bit about, like, what is Hadestown?
Yeah, so for some context, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, Hadestown is a Broadway musical, but it has a bit of it had a long path to get to Broadway. So the lyricist and writer and composer, I guess, of the musical version, Anais Mitchell, first premiered the original in Vermont in 2006 and then released it as a concept album in 2010, and then met the director, the person who became the director, Rachel Chavkin, in 2012 to work towards an off-Broadway workshop premiere in 2016, and then it finally premiered on Broadway in 2019.
Wow, you weren't kidding. That is a really long, like, path to Broadway.
Yeah, so, like, in that space of time, Hadestown has gotten a lot. It's kind of gotten, like, a cult following. Like, there are people who love the concept album.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I actually haven't, like, a disclosure, I have not actually listened to the concept album. I started with the Broadway cast recording, but, like, this musical has, like, a lot of fans, and the people who like it, like, love it.
Well, I mean, I get that. Having seen it now, like, I completely understand. That's interesting. I feel like I should probably check out the concept album now at some point. But, like, it's really interesting that the musical portion of it was developed first. And I think, I mean, when I was listening to the soundtrack again for our recording, it is amazing to me how much of the story is connected through song. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a musical, obviously, like, the song moves the story apart, but I felt like I was watching it again. There wasn't that same, like, distance that you sometimes have listening to the musical version, or the soundtrack version of a musical, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so full disclosure, neither of us are theater scholars, neither of us are musicologists. No. So
we like music.
We're looking at this as literature scholars who have watched the play, or who have watched the musical, and also, like, have some familiarity with the myth, or the myths, plural, I should say, on which it is based.
I mean, you know what? I won't go on that tangent. I was going to say, I don't think we're out of our depth here, even though we're not necessarily theater scholars, because, you know, it's all literature in one way, shape, or form. So,
yeah, but, like, I think there is probably some specific vocabulary related to theater that, like, this is a sung through musical, like, is the term that, like, I've seen. So kind of like, if you listen to, like, the Hamilton soundtrack, you get all of the story, and, like, all of the narration is, like, part of the songs. So, like, going back to my education in musical theater back from a long time ago, like, in that spectrum between, like, musical, operetta, opera, this is a musical, but because everything is part of the music, elementary school me would tell you this is an operetta. Elementary school me would be wrong, because the style of music is still different, but just the amount of singing is most of it.
So see, look, you were like, we're out of our depth here. And then you gave a whole breakdown of the different styles of, like, musical theater. This is why Corinne is the one that gives the context.
My sister has a master's degree in opera performance, so, like, whenever I try to talk about anything related to music, she tells me how I'm wrong. So.
Oh, well, maybe we should have had her on the podcast. So, rewinding a little bit, though, you were talking about how much you love Hadestown.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come to find it?
Yeah, so actually, one of my students put me onto it.
Really?
Yeah, in the spring of 2020, right before pandemic lockdown started, I had mentioned in my class that I was teaching on literature for the adolescent that I was doing some work on Olympus, which is a Hades and Persephone retelling. And one of my students came up to me after class and asked if I'd listened to Hadestown. And I was like, no, like, I've heard of it, but no, I haven't listened to it at all. And then I listened to it and got extremely obsessed with it and had it playing, like, all the time for, like, the first 2 months of lockdown. So much.
It was a weird time then.
It was a weird time. It was a weird vibe. And also, like, the feeling of being, like, trapped, like, in the underground.
Valid.
But, like, I listened to it so much that for my Spotify Wrapped for that year, I think I was in the top. I don't remember if it was 1% or 0.5% of listeners for Anais Mitchell.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh at you, but that's funny.
When I get into something, I get into it.
I think our listeners will know that by this point.
This is why I'm suited for C-drama consumption, you see.
This is true. If you're into it, you will watch 75 episodes of something.
In 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, this wasn't supposed to be the Clown Corinne hours, but you're taking part in it, so I guess it's fine.
All right. So then what was your exposure to Hadestown, Ayanni, before we saw it?
I had none. I had no exposure to Hadestown, except for Corinne being like, this is great. We should see it at some point. Another of my friends did go see it, I think actually like 2 weeks before we did, and she just talked about how much she loved it and how good it was. But I think I wanted to go into it not knowing anything. I think I love live music. I love live performances, and going to the theater I think is really, really special. Mm-hmm. So it was really nice for me to go, knowing, of course, like the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, knowing Hades and Persephone. So having like that cultural context, it was nice to go in and experience Hadestown as a complete piece for the first time, as my first introduction to it. And yeah, now I understand kind of why you were listening to the album over and over and over and over, because there's so much to love about it, and it's such, I think, an interesting interpretation of these two myths.
All right, so shall we move into giving a little bit of character and plot summary then for our listeners not familiar with Hadestown, like pre us seeing it, Ayanni?
Let's do it. So, to be 100% explicit, Hadestown is a retelling of the Eurydice and Orpheus myth and the Hades and Persephone myth.
So, for some context, in the Orpheus and Eurydice myth from Greek mythology, they're both mortal people, although I think probably Orpheus and maybe Eurydice also have some godly heritage, because, you know, that's always happening all the time in Greek myths. But Orpheus is a famous musician. He gets married to Eurydice. She gets bit by a snake and dies. And Orpheus is devastated by this and goes to the underworld to get her back. And Persephone intervenes with her husband, Hades, the king of the underworld, to let Orpheus take Eurydice back. But the deal that Hades makes is that Eurydice has to follow Orpheus silently all the way back out of the underworld, and Orpheus cannot look back to see if she's following him. And at the very end, in most versions of the myth that I've seen, Orpheus finally gets out of the underworld, steps back into the mortal realm, and then looks behind him to see Eurydice, but she has not yet taken the final step out of the underworld, so he loses her again, and that's that.
So unfair. And to quickly share the Hades and Persephone myth, there's been so many retellings of this over time. So I don't necessarily feel the need to like deeply go into it, but long and short of it, Persephone is the goddess of spring. She helps bring springtime to the mortal realm. Hades, god of the underworld, falls in love with Persephone. There are many ways that people have chosen to retell how the two of them come together, but ultimately Hades brings Persephone to the underworld. She eats something down there.
Normally pomegranate seeds.
Yeah, that cause her to be bound to the underworld. So because it wasn't like a whole pomegranate or it wasn't a bunch of stuff, she's not bound to the underworld forever, but that's why we have the cycle of the seasons, because 6 months out of the year Persephone is above ground, above ground, yeah, and then 6 months out of the year she is underground. But ultimately she and Hades get married and she becomes queen of the underworld too, so like it's not all bad for them, I guess.
Yeah, in different retellings there, the amount of consent that Persephone had about going to the underworld and marrying Hades differs.
Yeah, which is a very fair thing to say. Some retellings make it a lot more consensual than others, you could say.
But so in this version, we are mainly doing the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, but obviously then Hades and Persephone come into it, and Hades and Persephone's relationship is on the rocks.
That is a kind way to put it. They're having a hard time. Yeah, Hades does not want to, it seems, let Persephone do her full stint of springtime up above ground, which is making it really tough for the mortals, because she'll come up, things will be great and wonderful, the plants are flowering, everybody's got wine, and then like 3 months go by and Hades is like, nah girl, you need to come back down. Which means that when we are entering the story of Hadestown, things are tough. Food is kind of scarce, work is hard, nothing's growing. It's not a happy time in the mortal realm.
Well, and this is also a modern retelling, sort of. And
yes.
It has Depression era vibes, I would say. Like the costuming, and it feels very like, so the style of the music is very like Appalachian folk music with like maybe some jazz music in there. So it's not, this isn't like an ancient Greece setting. This is like the 1930s mining town, things are hard situation.
So since this is a modern retelling, as you so intelligently put it, Corinne, it might be helpful to give some context to the characters in the context of the story. Like, they have their ancient Greek names, but they've been updated for this setting.
So, first of all, we have Orpheus. When we saw it on Broadway, Jordan Fisher was playing Orpheus. Some of you might know him for playing John Lawrence in the Broadway cast of Hamilton. But he is a mortal man, he is a singer, and he's, quote, working on a song to fix what's wrong with the seasons, and then he gets romantically involved with Eurydice. Eurydice is also a mortal woman. She's a wanderer, she's had it rough. Her sort of moniker in the lyrics is that she was a hungry young girl, and she gets romantically involved with Orpheus somewhat against her better judgment. When we saw it on Broadway, she was played by Belen Moyano, who was actually an understudy for Eurydice.
Yeah, we actually saw a lot of understudies when we went to see it on Broadway.
Yeah, I was not the only person getting sick at that time of year.
Yeah, apparently not. Well, in that, next up we have Hades, who we know is the god of the underworld, but also in this context, something of a, as Corinne put in the notes, a fascist leader. But he is a boss of kind of the mining town that exists in the underworld. So not so much the mining town of the mortal realm, but this is like an underworld thing that's going on. He was played by Eddie Noel Rodriguez when we saw him on Broadway. Rodriguez was an understudy for Philip Boykin, who we didn't get to see. So it was interesting. Rodriguez apparently also is the understudy for Hermes, which is interesting. So
yeah, so for some context for that, this is, I think, actually kind of important for how the musical is written. Orpheus has a really, really high tenor voice, and Hades is supposed to have like a bass baritone, like think Disney villain kind of voice. So I actually saw the touring cast of Hadestown in February because I'm insane, and saw Hadestown and was like, you know what I would like to do? See it again.
You're just a fan. I'm not going to call you insane for that.
So when I saw the touring cast in Jacksonville, Hades was played by Matthew Patrick Quinn, who has originated a lot of the Disney villain parts on the Disney Cruise Line, actually.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I think it actually really affected our original viewing of Hadestown for Hades to be played by someone who is not a bass baritone. Patrick Page was the original Hades in the original Broadway cast, and his like very, very deep voice is both in opposition to Orpheus and really like, I don't know, it changes the whole vibe to have someone who essentially had to sing the whole Hades part like an octave up.
Interesting. And I think we might have said this, but I'll say it again. We'll throw a link to the cast recording in the show notes so you can kind of get a sense for what we're talking about if you're not familiar with the sound of Hadestown, let's say. So next we have a Persephone, who's the goddess of spring, married to Hades. And as I said, she's supposed to spend 6 months above ground and 6 months below, but that balance has been upset. She also has a little bit of a drinking problem, I think, to cope with things not going quite right, but also the fact that her marriage is on the rocks, which also makes me think of a drinking metaphor. So look at that. But when we saw Persephone on Broadway, she was played by Betty Who, and they were fantastic in this role. So Corinne was telling me that Betty Who had a very different energy than a lot of the other Persephones that you've seen.
Yeah, so for some context about that, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Betty Who, I looked up their height afterward, because Betty Who is like 6'3".
Yeah, they're tall.
And when we saw the show, they were also wearing like boots with like a 4 or 5 foot heel, and their hair was all
4 or 5 foot
inches. My bad. And their hair was also done to add another like 3 or 4 inches on top. So that made Persephone legitimately seem like 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
Like, and they were so good as Persephone. Like, I'm not really a person who really goes in for like the step on me thing, but seeing Betty Who play Persephone, I was like, oh.
I get it.
I get it now. But
the boots didn't hurt with that, I'm sure.
But when I saw Persephone in the touring cast in Jacksonville, she was played by Alanna Gordon, who is more of like a diminutive African American woman. So closer to like 5 feet tall. I don't know if she was actually 5
my
feet.
height.
Yeah. So she was like a very tiny person with a huge voice, like still super amazing, but very just a totally different vibe than Betty Who, like a tall blonde white woman.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, I don't give step on me vibes. So like, I totally understand what you're saying.
So it's really interesting all of the different ways that Persephone can be played and how that also changes the way that like Hades being played differently can make a difference.
And you know, that's an excellent way to kind of mention Hermes as well, because one of the things that's interesting about Hermes is that it feels like across the different renditions of the character in Hadestown, they're played by a variety of different people. But I think all of them have been Black folks.
All of them that I know of, yeah.
So our Hermes was played by Malcolm Armwood on Broadway. He was actually an understudy, which is really interesting. I forget where he was originally in the cast. But he, I think, did a great job. Hermes is, quote, a man with feathers on his feet. He's the god of roads and travelers, among other things. And in this version of the story, he takes Orpheus under his wing and is kind of the narrator that guides us through the story. Originally, I think, in the Broadway cast, and I think she's not going to be playing anymore after like March 17th. The actor was Lilias White, who I think would have been interesting to see as Hermes. But it feels like all of the ones that I've seen, including the gentleman who played Hermes in the original Broadway cast, they all have super different vibes. So it kind of changes the interpretation of that character, like you were saying with Persephone.
Yeah, Hermes, I think, as a character, is given a lot of space to be interpreted differently. Like, at the end of the day, like, it's an Orpheus Eurydice love story and a Hades and Persephone love story, but, like, Hermes as narrator can be a lot of different things.
Right. But has to be wearing a fantastic suit. Like, that's the rule.
They have to be wearing a fantastic suit, and they have to, like, own the room.
Yeah.
Like, the way that Hadestown opens, because I had a lot of expectations going in, basically having, like, the OBC cast recording, like, memorized, is, like, it starts with silence, and everyone, like, comes on stage. Also, the orchestra, the band, is on stage the whole time, and, like, in these sort of Depression era costumes.
Right.
And it starts with everyone coming on stage, and the cast, like, take their seats, and then Hermes comes in, and Hermes has to have enough presence to get the audience to quiet down and, like, wait for Hermes to open the show.
To actually begin.
So, rounding out the cast, we also have the Fates, who are the three women who are meant to be, like, not human. They're kind of creepy. But, like, they also have some of my favorite songs in the whole musical.
Oh, yeah. I love their outfits, too.
Oh, yeah. They're so... They do remind me of, like, the way that the Fates are characterized in, like, Disney's Hercules a little bit.
Oh, interesting.
Like, not exactly, but they have that sort of, like, grayed out, not human,
okay,
always, like, always lurking in the back of your mind sort of feeling. And then the ensemble also, we won't really talk about them necessarily, but, like, the ensemble does great work. They play mortals in, like, the world above. They also play people trapped in the mining town below, and, like, they're working hard that whole show.
Yeah, they are.
So, by giving you the myths, we have kind of given you the plot here already. But the way that Hadestown works out is it interweaves Hades and Persephone's myth with Orpheus and Eurydice. And there is some sort of productive ambiguity going on. Like, when Hades... So, the setup here is, like, the town, the station that Orpheus and Eurydice live in. But although Eurydice doesn't live there until she ends up with Orpheus, is on a railroad line to hell. And when Hades comes and gives, like, Eurydice her ticket, quote unquote, to the underworld, there's this sort of productive ambiguity about whether or not she's, like, taking a train, whether she's dying, whether she's being seduced. But so basically it is the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, except that she goes to this town underground and becomes a miner, becomes a worker. Yeah. And forgets her identity, and then Orpheus has to come and with this song that he's been working on forever, in order to, like, convince Hades, with the help of Persephone, to let him try and take Eurydice back. To the mortal realm.
Yeah, so there's not so much, like, a snake bite, right? There's a little bit more...
There is a little bit of, like, a snake bite. So there's not a literal snake bite, but they do some stuff with, like, a rattlesnake imagery and, like, rattlesnake sounds in the song.
Yeah. But it's more a metaphorical snake than, like, she gets bitten.
And it is a choice that Eurydice makes. To leave Orpheus. Because he's busy working on his song, and she's starving.
Yeah. Which, I mean, valid. And there's also a big storm that rolled through, so, like, it's a lot. So we've been talking a little bit about kind of our initial impressions and some of our kind of thoughts as we're going through the Broadway version of the show and kind of comparing it to what you saw in Jacksonville. But what are things that stood out to you about Hadestown? Like, are there favorite moments that rise to the surface for you? Are there numbers that mean a lot to you?
So there were definitely some numbers that I expected to be standouts for me. Like, not everyone, but if people have heard only one thing from Hadestown, they've probably heard Wait For Me, which great, iconic, love it, well done. But the one that I was especially looking forward to was Why We Build the Wall. And
why?
Well, it has this call and response format. It's right after Eurydice has been taken to the underworld, and it's Hades doing this, like, asking, like, his citizens, his prisoners, I don't know what they are, like,
Staff?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's like, why do we build the wall? And they, like, respond, like, we build the wall to keep us free, like, to keep out the enemy is poverty, and, like, it's a very much, like, well, and keep in mind, I listened to this musical for the first time in 2020 when a certain someone was still president.
Now I see why you're drawing this fascist connection.
Yeah.
Got it.
And this was composed and written before the, like, build the wall slogan
Right.
became so, like, such a thing. And it was just so on the nose. And, like, anyway, it was super, super good. And the way that Build the Wall, or Why We Build the Wall, builds from this very sort of, like, simple call and response format to, like, Hades is, like, almost, like, yelling it, or not in, like, a yelling at you kind of way, but in a, like, fascist speech giving kind of way. And it's so, like, in contrast. Like, when we see it, it's a very stationary song, because this musical has a lot of
standing.
This musical has a lot of kinetic energy for the most part, but with this, in this song, Hades is in the center of the stage with, like, an old-timey microphone, and the rest of the cast, minus Orpheus, is, like, circles around the stage, not moving, just doing this call and response, and it was so good. One that I didn't expect to like, or that, like, has never stood out for me when I listened to the cast recording, is how it's called How Long, and it's the piece where Persephone is trying to persuade Hades to give Orpheus a shot, to convince him to let him take Eurydice back. And when we saw it on Broadway, the, like, chemistry between Persephone and Hades was, like, electric to me. That song had a lot more kinetic energy to it, because they're, like, circling each other and, like, moving very quickly.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a piece where, like, I know, like, the romance between Hades and Persephone, but, like, that moment in the Broadway musical, when I watched it, I was like, oh, I understand why these two people who, like, don't seem to love each other anymore and just seem to be making each other unhappy, I see why they did love each other. I see, like, that root of their relationship is still there. And so much of that is from the way that the two actors that we saw performed those roles and their relationship with each other.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is why I wanted to come into the musical not knowing anything, because the staging and the blocking and how bodies are moving is just so important to how the story is told. So I'm not surprised that you kind of had a revelatory moment with part of the soundtrack, having seen it live. So for me, because this was all new to me, the thing that I think stood out to me the most and that I took away the most was Jordan Fisher's performance as Orpheus. I just thought he was phenomenal. His voice was beautiful. I kind of believed him as he moved about the stage.
Yeah.
But the thing that was so shocking to me is that, like, the core melody of the show, I think it's called Epic, like, they reprise it a few times, Epic 1, Epic 2, Epic 3, right? It's, and you can, like, tell me if I'm using terminology that doesn't make sense here, but it's just such a, like, clear and light melody that, you know, when we finally get to Orpheus's complete song, has different kind of resonances and different kind of voices added onto it and all that kind of stuff. But it's just it was such a beautiful melody to me, and Fisher did such a good job with the performance that almost any time he opened up his mouth and started doing his la-las, I burst into tears. And that is such a kind of profound experience to me, being moved by music and by a performance in that way, that I think that's something that stuck with me. Like, I was dancing for a lot of the performance, right? I think a lot of the kind of jazz infused music really got me, like, tapping my feet and wiggling around. But every time Orpheus sang, I just was like not stunned into stillness, but there was just
You're like
there was a
entranced.
moving resonance. Yeah, entranced is a good word.
Well, like I could understand why like Persephone and Hades would be so moved by his song to do something completely against, for Hades at least, to do something completely against character and let Eurydice, or almost let Eurydice go.
He still has to maintain his nation. He can't let it be chaos, Corinne. but yeah, I just think Fisher was excellent in the role, and I believed it. And I feel like for me with this performance, I don't know, he tied it all together for me, I think.
So something that was really interesting for me, seeing it twice so close back to back with completely different casts, is that when we saw it on Broadway, and I don't know if this would be different if we hadn't seen the Hades understudy, like, it was the Orpheus show. Jordan Fisher owned it. It was all about him. He and not that the other performances weren't good. They were great.
No, absolutely.
We also loved Betty Who, obviously, and but it was just like, it was the Orpheus show. Yeah. And when I saw the touring cast, it was Hades' show.
Interesting.
Like, it felt like it was all about Hades, or like just waiting for Hades to get there. Once he does, he had the most stage presence.
Interesting.
And that was just like a very different, it's the same story, but like it feels different when Orpheus can hold his own against Hades, and when he like maybe can't quite manage that.
Yeah. I mean, and this is why like every theatrical performance is its own bag, right? I feel like you can't see the same play twice. Yeah. You know? Even if you're seeing the same actors, because there's human beings up on the stage, you know, and how they're doing that day is going to impact the show that you see. So, yeah, I'm really glad we got to see it with this cast and with Jordan Fisher, because now when I listen to the soundtrack, I'm like, that's not my Orpheus. Okay, it's all right, I guess.
So, how does it work for you as a myth adaptation, as someone who went in not knowing exactly how it was going to end, what they were going to do? How did that work for you?
So the simple answer is, I think it worked. I think I already had buy-in though, right? Like, I'm somebody who enjoys Hades and Persephone retellings. Like, I will seek out that kind of content, right? Part of, since we talked about our work earlier in the show, when I was working on my dissertation, something that I was thinking of doing a chapter on, but then, you know, big dreams sometimes fall apart. I was thinking a lot about how lords of the underworld are used as love interests. So thinking about Hades, but also thinking about like stories that have Lucifer as a love interest. So I'm always interested in kind of like that dark prince figure taken literally, and how both he can entrance a character in narrative, but then also like entrance people who are viewing, the viewing audience, right? So I was already kind of bought in, because I was like, hey, Hades and Persephone, I'm here for it. And I think this adaptation, especially because we're playing with like time period here, really worked both as a love story kind of story, but then also with some of the other elements that they threaded in. So yeah, I don't know, I think it worked. I enjoyed it, but I think Orpheus and Eurydice hurts like as a myth, right? Because you know it's going to go bad. And I think the whole time, because of how the story is put together and because of the music moving me through and seeing the chemistry between the actors, I was like, maybe it'll be okay.
And they even have that like in the lyrics to the opening song, like it's a love song, it's a tragedy, like maybe it might turn out this time.
I was like, maybe Hermes, it'll turn out okay this time. But it doesn't. And I think because I let myself believe that it could, it makes it all the more heartbreaking when it goes the way I know it's going to go. Yeah. So I honestly, I think that's a great use of the myth, right? Is getting me to believe that the myth is going to do something else, you know?
Well, and like
when
thinking
it doesn't.
about like the oral tradition, when you're hearing something, like thinking about like myths and folklore and fairy tales, like maybe it could turn out this time, depending on who's telling it and how they're telling it. So like that's not the case for like a staged musical, but also like
no,
maybe.
I don't know. I was hoping, but also because I had come into it no knowledge. So I was like, maybe they'll surprise me and there'll be joy. It was not joy. I'm going to assume that you love this Smith adaptation.
I do.
No notes, 10 out of 10.
I do, yeah.
So I was gonna say, like, since we know your deep feelings on it, maybe we can drill into one of the specifics that I kind of was skirting around in my discussion, is how Hadestown uses the cycle of story.
Yeah.
Right? And that there is this sense that is brought to us both at the beginning and end of the story that repetition is happening, that we're caught in a loop almost.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to hear your feelings on this because you went to see it again, like so close to the first time. So you almost perpetuated the looping that they were talking about. So like for me, I was devastated at the end, but I can go away and convince myself, and I had texted this to you, that like maybe 20 loops from now, something will be different. Maybe in the multiverse of Orpheus and Eurydice, they met in high school in 2025 and they fell in love and it was fine, right?
Yeah.
But
maybe he didn't look back that time.
He didn't look back. Maybe because, like, you know, he had more confidence in himself. He had a good peer leader when he was a freshman. So now he has the confidence to trust that, like, people have his back and he doesn't turn around. But what was the experience for you, like, hearing, you know, it's an old song, it's a sad song, and then going back and knowing it's an old and sad song and knowing you're signing up for the same stuff again?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't seen it, the setup at the beginning with all of the cast at this station and like at this cafe where Orpheus works, they reset to that at the end of the musical.
Yes,
like,
they do.
They start the themes. They have Eurydice's like, anybody got a match first line again. So like I wasn't expecting this to happen when I saw it the second time, but so when it ended, the friend that I saw it with like was like, "Oh, like did it get you? Did you cry?" And I was like, "Yeah, like I cried for like most of it." And she was like, "Oh, I didn't notice." But they got me from the very beginning before anyone even had like said a line, because they did this. The cast came out and were like in this basically what to me was a reset to the beginning position. And as Hermes was coming on the stage, like getting ready to like open the show, he had this moment where he like put his hand on Eurydice's shoulder, like you okay, girl? Like, you ready to do it again? Which to me, having just seen it, was like, oh man, like it felt to me like she had just done it and was about to do it again. Like she had just gotten sent back to the underworld and was going to try it again. And I started like tearing up from like the first 5 seconds of the show before like the band had like played a single note.
Like, you're getting me a little emotional actually here talking about it. Like, it's so sad.
So the cyclicality worked for me, I would say.
Oh God.
They got me.
Yeah. And like adding on to that, I have only seen it once, right? But I listened to the soundtrack again to prep for this episode, and it was like being right back into that cycle. And what makes it worse is that Spotify at the end will just loop it back to the beginning. And I'm like, no, I'm not forcing them to do this again. We're gonna stop here. So like I think that's a really, really smart thing that is built into the show that the, you know, creative team put together, that it is stuck on this loop, right? That the story will continue even when you leave the theater, right? Even if you start writing fanfics in your head about how they're happier, you know, 25 years from now because something broke, right? I just think that's so genius. It really does work for me.
Yeah, and so, like, it also specifically is built into the show. Like, the characters talk about it. Like, Hermes as the narrator, like, is, like, it's built into this idea that, like, to sing it again, even knowing how it ends, is still worth doing. And it's like this idea that even if you know something will fail, that doesn't mean it's not worth trying to do. And it's, it's, like, profound.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's actually a lot happening in this musical that I hope we get a chance to talk about, because the focus is, of course, that it's these two intertwined love stories, but I think there's some other things that are being woven in there that are interesting and valuable.
Yeah, but shall we look more specifically at those two intertwined love stories and then maybe broaden out from there?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Right, so what is Orpheus and Eurydice's relationship like in this retelling? How would you describe it?
Ooh, that's a good question. It burns hot, I think, at first. I think Orpheus's first line to Eurydice, what is it? Is it like,
come home with me?
Come home with me, right? Which he doesn't mean to sound suggestive, but of course everyone hears it as suggestive, right?
Yeah.
So it burns hot. And I think Eurydice, of course, is a little reluctant. She's like, oh, where are you coming from, singer boy? Like, ooh, coming on too strong. But I think she gets it pretty quickly how special he is. So I don't want to say it burns hot and fast and then flames out, because I don't think that's quite what it is. But I think they come together very quickly. It is naive. Yeah. It is naive. But I think it's sweet in that naivete, in a sense that, like, and I'm bringing my own experiences into this, right? But as an audience member, you want that naive love to work.
It's very much like a first love kind of thing. Well, it's certainly Orpheus's first love. Eurydice is a little bit more jaded. But like that sort of like the seduction of Eurydice by Orpheus is very much like him sort of like promising like all of making all these extravagant promises that he's never really going to be able to keep.
It's funny. I almost don't want to use the word seduction though. Like, I know it's not a bad word, right? But I don't think he's seducing her. I think he really wants to. It's different than
like the seduction of Eurydice by Hades later.
Exactly. I think Orpheus is really like, we can get married, and the trees will give us the feast for our wedding, and I'll make us rings out of flowers. Like, it's a sweet kind of like, I'm so enraptured with you, I'll do whatever I have to.
I was like, I'm so excited.
Happy. Yeah, it's a puppy love kind of a thing, right? And I think that's also part of perhaps why it falls apart when, you know, Eurydice is called to by Hades.
Yeah.
Right? Because she cannot put her full trust in his sweetness, because he also gets enraptured in his song, right? And trying to finish it and doesn't hear her calling out to him. So, yeah, I think sweetness, naive are good words. They really do want to love each other and be together. But like Orpheus, I feel like does not have enough world experience almost, if that makes sense. Yeah. And also he allows certain voices to get into his head, you know, and he looks back before everything is settled. So what about you? You seem to kind of be vibing with what I was saying, but are there other things that you would want to bring?
I mean, I think thinking about Orpheus and Eurydice's relationship at the beginning versus when Orpheus goes to get Eurydice in the underworld and the kind of promises they make to each other. Like, the first, their first sort of song is the wedding song, and All I've Ever Known are very much those sort of like unrealistic promises, or idealistic promises, I should say.
Idealistic, yes. I think that's better.
And then the versions of the promises that they make to each other when Orpheus goes to get Eurydice, and she is much more jaded, and also maybe so is he a little bit. But the kind of promises that they make to each other are not like, I will find like this golden band and like everything will be perfect. It's more like, I will walk with you whatever way the wind blows. So and like Orpheus has this moment of, well, an early moment of doubt where he like asks, like, are you sure you want to come? Like, it's a long road, it's a long walk back into the cold and dark. So like he's not promising her something easy, and the promises that they make to each other are much more realistic.
I also think that's really important, though, that they're making promises to each other. Because in that first song, it's Orpheus making all of these promises to convince Eurydice to be his girl. And in the second one, it's more about, this is what we're going to do together. We're going to stand by each other. And we know it's going to be difficult, but we're going to do it in tandem, which I feel like is a much less idealistic way of thinking about a relationship and about a union. But yeah, I think that's also why I really wanted it to work, because they were now talking to each other as a unit rather than, you know, the early courting, I'll give you the sun and moon and stars.
Yeah.
Right? So how would, I guess running with that, how would you describe Hades and Persephone's relationship? And let's kind of split it in half like we did for Orpheus and Eurydice. How would you describe it in the beginning? And then we can think about it kind of in the back half of the story.
Wow, they're like an old couple who like need to get divorced. Like, because we're also doing like prep for our divorce comedy series. Like, if I was watching this and like seeing them at the beginning, like I would be yelling at like the TV screen, like, divorce.
I would be texting you, Corinne, divorce. Yes.
Well, because like Hades has gotten more and more afraid that Persephone won't come back. Persephone is high off her ass the whole time she's in the underworld, because it's the only way she can stand it.
Wait, is she doing drugs too? I thought she was just drunk.
Oh, there's like also the suggestion that she like is doing morphine. Like,
oh, well, okay then.
She's having
out
of it. And she's out of it on purpose, because like she and her husband like kind of hate each other now.
Yeah.
And Hades is like trying to like get her attention and get her to love him again, and like he suggests that's the reason he continues to industrialize the underworld. But she, as the goddess of spring, is like, no, none of this is natural. It's too hot. It's too bright. I'm supposed to be above ground right now. Like, what's wrong with you?
And I was thinking about what you were saying, and I think the track is Word to the Wise, where Hades is talking about, you know, things you need to do to keep a woman, fill her pockets with stones, like diamonds, give her bracelets and rings to lock her down and trap her, right? He's not thinking about union. He's thinking about holding.
I think
and
it's
confining.
The reprise of Chant.
It's reprise of Chant?
Yeah.
Okay. Because he keeps saying, because I'm an old man. Listen to an old man.
Yeah, so that's the Chant reprise before
reprise.
Epic 3, which is the... Epic 3 is Orpheus's big song.
Okay. Yes, it is. Oh, you're absolutely right. Okay.
Word to the Wise is one of my favorite songs by the Fates.
Oh, that's the Fates song. Okay, yes. All right. But yeah, he's thinking about not Persephone as his partner, not Persephone as his wife, but Persephone as something he owns. And
someone he needs to cage. And he's upset that she doesn't appreciate, quote, like the comforts of a gilded cage.
Right, exactly. Especially, you know, he also talks about owning the workers that are there. So
yeah,
he's all about containing and controlling in this early part. And well, here's a question for you, Corinne. Are you convinced that they can work things out after they hear Orpheus's song about how they fell in love?
No. I mean, that's part of the cyclicality of it, right? Like, there's like, so like when Persephone goes back above ground, she's like, how about us? Like, are we gonna try again? And Hades is like, well, it's time for spring. Goodbye. And her she's like, wait for me, I will. And there is a suggestion that they will try again in the fall, but it to me feels like as much of a doomed enterprise as Orpheus trying to get Eurydice back. But
yeah.
And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't try, but like it feels doomed in the same way that Orpheus and Eurydice do, at least in this retelling.
So it's interesting because you're right. I don't disagree with you, but it seemed like it, when I'm thinking back to my experience of watching it, right? In a sense, it felt like Hades and Persephone end this moment in a higher place, like a place of reconciliation, whereas Orpheus and Eurydice ended in a place of falling apart, of disillusionment. And so you're right, by the nature of the the cyclicality, they too were going to fall back into the same bullshit place of needing to be divorced that they were at the start. But it was almost like, to me, and this is 100% me bringing my own shit to the performance. This is not something that was in there, but almost like because they are gods, they can transcend the cyclical trap that Orpheus and Eurydice are stuck in. That they are moving on to a better place, right? And Orpheus and Eurydice are trapped in the same shit that they've been trapped in, which I know in the grand scheme of things is actually not the case, but it was just the way that they parted with this sense of like, we have been changed, right?
Yeah.
And Orpheus and Eurydice are changed but are still trapped.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I think kind of like you said, like both things are kind of true.
Mm-hmm.
Because like there is this like hope that they will be okay, but yeah, I don't know. It's hard because Hades is like the villain of this narrative as much as this narrative has a villain. And
yeah,
like thinking about, well, what I want for my fiction and what I want for real life are different. But like in real life,
yes, 100%.
In real life, like this man is abusive.
Yes,
and wanting an abusive man to change feels antithetical to like what I want or believe.
Sure. But as you said, what you want from your fiction and what you want from real life is different. If this was real life and Persephone was my friend, I'd be like, girl, you need to leave him. Like, he wants to put you in a cage?
Yeah, like, even if he promises he's gonna change, like, he won't. He can't.
Yeah, you know, he's literally building a wall around everything.
Those are the promises that abusive people make in, like, the cycle of abuse.
Yeah. But, because this is fiction, I just want everybody to be happy, right? And I think because I was so upset by the end, I was perhaps looking for any spark of joy that I could. So I don't know.
Yeah. Also, just like a quick note for Hades and Persephone, and the way that who is playing them makes a difference. So like when I saw the touring cast, the man playing Hades was like super tall. Like he was tall and lanky and like he like looked. That man has to have been at least like 6'6". I don't know, man.
Oh, he's a big man.
A big but like skinny man.
Oh, a long boy.
And then, which is part of why Persephone looked so small. Because she was like, she could have easily been my height. She could have been 5'8", and she still would have been a full foot shorter than this man. I'm sure I'm exaggerating his height a little bit, but he just looked very tall. But in our version that we saw on Broadway,
yeah,
the man playing Hades was like he was like a bulkier man, and he was tall, but he was not 7 feet tall the way that they had, like styled Betty Who. So it was really interesting to have Hades be smaller than Persephone. So like after Orpheus's big song and this sort of moment of reconciliation between Hades and Persephone in the touring cast, when I saw it, like Persephone was like in Hades' arms with her head like on his shoulder. If it even reached his shoulder, I don't know that it did.
I was gonna say, I don't think it did, actually.
So, like, when we saw it on the original Broadway cast, he had his head on her shoulder, which was a sort of, like, moment of gender reversal that I think...
Yeah.
I think having Persephone be, like, as much or more larger than life as Hades made their relationship feel more potentially... Like, it had more potential to be even.
Ah, that's interesting. And maybe the way I'm reading that gesture is also not capitulation, right? But also kind of a sense of like, I find my softness in you as well. Yeah. Right? You hold me just as much as I hold you. And
that makes a difference.
Yeah, it does. Huh. And see, this is why somewhere in the Hadestown AU, there's happiness to be found, because even in these different versions of the same story, we feel like there are different ways that Hades and Persephone's relationship could potentially go. And that's really interesting. I almost wish that I had seen the Jacksonville one with you now as a point of comparison.
You should have come to Jacksonville.
I should have just flown down. I could have made it work.
What about the intersections between Orpheus and Eurydice and Hades and Persephone?
What do you mean?
I think, so there's a way in which, and this was maybe more clear the second time I saw it, there's like an affinity between Orpheus and Persephone. Like Persephone, having met him in the world up above, is very fond of him. So like when he comes to the underworld, she is willing to intercede with her husband, and even though she doesn't know if she'll succeed, she like, there's sort of like a fondness between them, which is mirrored in like a sort of dark way in like the relationship between Hades and Eurydice, because I don't know, I we should talk as well about Hades and Eurydice's relationship and how like these two couples affect and influence each other.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, it almost feels like Hades and Eurydice are a dark reflection of Persephone and Orpheus, because, I mean, it doesn't hurt that Hades brings Eurydice to the underworld, whereas Orpheus and Persephone's connection is above ground, right?
Yeah.
During the springtime. So I think the connection, thinking about Orpheus and Persephone, right? Orpheus is very, I don't want to say aggrandizing, but he has a little moment where he talks about how great Persephone is when everyone's like raising their glass because they're excited that she's there and spring is going to happen. So there is this kind of like, it almost feels like Orpheus looks up to her, and there's this positivity. He wants to reinvigorate spring and make things right again with his song, and Persephone is the embodiment of that rightness, right? Whereas if we're looking at Hades and Eurydice, Hades is preying on all of the things that Eurydice is worried about.
Yeah.
There's not that uplifting. It is a dragging and pulling down, right? And, you know, I'm going to put a little content warning note here, right? But there's the question of whether Hades assaults Eurydice, right?
Yeah.
And listening to the soundtrack, I felt that less. Watching the performance, I felt the possibility more.
Really? I think I felt it more listening to the soundtrack than seeing it performed. Okay, so for context for listeners,
yes,
the way and the reason that Hades goes to get Eurydice is like he has essentially a fight with Persephone in Chant, the first version.
The first version.
And he's like, well, I will find someone who appreciates everything that I have to offer. And then he goes and finds Eurydice, and they have the song Hey Little Songbird, which is more like the seduction of Eurydice.
Right.
And then the way that the first act closes is that he has Eurydice step into his office, and Hermes' narration is like, a lot can happen behind closed doors.
Yeah.
A lot can happen on the factory floor too. But like it sort of ends with Hades letting Eurydice step into his office, and then the doors close, and then Persephone is like, well, anybody want a drink? And that's the end of the first act. And that is the moment where, like, is Eurydice just signing paperwork? Is she being sexually assaulted? Is she consenting to a relationship with Hades of some kind? But also, is consent even possible because of the power difference there?
Oh, well, I just assumed consent wasn't possible, but that was just me. I mean, so the reason the Broadway production felt more like it leaned more into something sexual happening is that our Hades loosened his tie, and there was a sense of undressing that was happening when he went into this room to conduct business. Now, I know a loosened tie can also represent like, oh, I'm home from a long days of work. But when you're going into signed paperwork and you're starting to take clothes off, that to me has a sexual overtone, right? However, listening to the soundtrack, because there is no intermission, right? I'm just listening to the whole thing all the way through. Hermes has another immediate kind of line, and I'm not going to be able to quote it as well as you can, but pretty much that Eurydice had signed paperwork and signed her life away, right? There is that kind of direct statement of like, things were signed, right? Which when you see the actual bodies and the acting and how they come out of the room, and Eurydice is kind of like flustered and she's in new clothes and all of this kind of stuff, that adds a layer to me that's not there when I'm just listening to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's one of those moments of productive ambiguity.
Yeah, I agree. But you kind of, well, let me ask then, in Jacksonville, like, was your impression in the Jacksonville version different than from seeing it on Broadway? Especially because we have different size actors who are up against each other. Like, our Eurydice was a smaller, slighter actor, right? Went up against our taller, somewhat thicker Hades.
So I don't know that I had a different impression in Jacksonville, but I think by that point my interpretation had already kind of been baked in.
Okay.
Of that sequence. And I mean, my interpretation is that could go either way. Could be convinced of either thing. I did ask the person that I saw it with, and she didn't get sexual assault at all.
Interesting.
From watching it.
So this is another case of what you bring to your performance, because we think about sex a lot.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Well, and also, like, so taking it back to Persephone a little bit, and the opening number of Act 2, Our Lady of the Underground, that's another one where I got totally different vibes from seeing it performed than I do from listening to it. Because listening to it...
Speak on that.
So listening to it, it feels like a party. Not like as fun of a party, like as upbeat of a party up as the above ground one.
Okay.
It's not the same vibe as Living It Up on Top,
right?
Which is the above ground party, but it still feels like she's still like drinking with the workers while they're off work, because listening to it, there's still like a chorus backing her up. But when you see it staged, the people backing her up are just the band and Hermes. There is no one else there. She is drinking and talking about, like, getting a glimpse of the sun and of the sky. She's not literally getting those things. She is only getting those things by being drunk and high. And she's doing all of this while Hades is in his office with Eurydice.
Yeah.
So it's much sadder and depressing.
And I guess the way I also read it was her trying to convince other people and herself that she is still this powerful goddess. Like, who wants all these things? I can do all these things. I'm just as powerful as Hades is. You know, I'm fucking Persephone, okay? You know, but you're right. She's drunk and she's stumbling around and she can, you know, barely stand up straight. So it's kind of like it is sad.
I think part of it as well is that in the Broadway version, Betty Who played that much drunker. Like, she was doing
Didn't she almost like fall off the stage at one point?
Yeah, like, I mean, I'm sure it was on purpose, but like,
yes, on purpose.
She was just doing a lot more stumbling and a lot more like, and she performed the heck out of it, but
100% yes.
But the Persephone that I saw in Jacksonville, Alanna Gordon, is more of like a belter than a folk style singer.
Oh, okay.
And she didn't play it as drunk, so she did not seem as upset.
Interesting.
Which I think then affected the interpretation of my friend who I saw it with, which is like, well, I asked her about it afterward, and she's like, oh, like, Persephone seemed fine, so like, I don't think it could be sexual assault, because Persephone wouldn't be fine. She wouldn't be having like a party if that was happening.
Interesting. Oh, this is so interesting. Maybe sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
Productive ambiguity, I guess, is my phrase of the day.
Ambiguity. It is. It's like on Sesame Street. Today's phrase is productive ambiguity.
The letter of the day is P.
Yeah, right?
P for Persephone.
And A. Oh.
A for ambiguity. A for assault? I don't know.
Oh, boo. No. That made it less fun. No. Not on my version of Sesame Street.
Bad joke.
Oh, goodness. So, writing this wave of productive ambiguity, I will say I really appreciate that you added this to the outline, because I think thinking about both relationships and then how they cross-sect is super useful in thinking about Hadestown. But I wanted to just spend a little bit of time thinking a bit about some of the other things that are happening in the play, because while, of course, Orpheus was who I came away from the performance being like, oh, that was amazing, there were also some, I don't want to say messages, that feels a little like...
Themes.
Didactic. Yeah, interesting themes that were coming through that you and I had talked about briefly, but I don't think we really had a chance to like dive into. And I know the one that jumped out for me was kind of like collective power, right?
Oh yeah, and in a lot of ways this is Join Your Union, the musical.
Yeah, because when it comes to going out of the underworld, Orpheus and Eurydice are like, okay, we're going to do this together. Eurydice has to follow Orpheus, but she's not the only one that is moved by what's happening. Like, the ensemble cast that are playing the workers, right, also are like, we're done. We're going to drop our axes and we're going to follow Orpheus out of here, right? There's this kind of coming together that like, oh, there's a line that's, you know, we together are stronger than one of them alone. So, yeah, how did seeing the performance impact kind of your like sense of the fact of this as Join Your Union, the musical?
Yeah, so If It's True, I think, is the song that Ayanni is thinking about. And that's the one where... So Orpheus has just gotten the shit beat out of him by the workers at Hades' command. And then he has this, like...
Which was beautifully staged, by the way.
Oh,
There's,
yeah.
like, swinging lights and all this stuff is happening. It's really great, but go ahead.
But he has this, like, if it's true that nothing changes, why bother? Like, if we stand together, like, we can... all of us together are stronger than one of us alone. And, like, it's just this really... this moment of I don't know exactly even how to describe it, because it doesn't work for me on the cast recording in the same way. Like when I on the cast recording, that's when I skip.
Oh, interesting. Really?
Yeah. But like it's sort of like one of the climaxes of the musical, that like to have all these workers stand up and join him, and that is part of why Hades has to listen to Orpheus. Like it's because Persephone like tries to convince him to, but it's also because like his workers are about to mutiny.
Yeah.
And like there is this sense that like, so then when Hades agrees to let Orpheus take Eurydice if she won't look at him, there's the sense that like if she's following Orpheus and the workers are following Eurydice,
yeah,
and that's the way out, is like working together and standing against the ones who hold the cards, the ones who roll the dice, and always the dice are always loaded. But if we like stand together against them, against the bosses,
right,
then like we can do it.
Right, we can move towards the light, as it were. I think the thing that was interesting for me, because I agree that it is Join Your Union, the musical, in a lot of ways, is that Orpheus fails them.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I guess something that I've been thinking about is how that impacts the message, right? Because even though it's about coming together, they were still dependent on this one man. And it almost seems like, yes, we should band together, but we need to band together and support each other. Like, another one of my headcanons that I imagine is that, like, even though Orpheus failed them, part of it was learning the way and that it could be done. So I imagine that Eurydice in the underworld then becomes the union leader, and they get better, like, bargaining rights and stuff like that, so that they get time off, But I think there's something to be said for, like, allowing people to show you the way, but then not putting all of your trust and faith into one person.
Yeah.
When we're talking about like organizing and all that kind of stuff, because this is a tragedy, right? So.
Well, and I think that's one of those moments where the sort of quote unquote message of like, it doesn't always turn out, but it might some of the time, and just because you won't always win like sweeping victories doesn't mean it's not worth doing.
Right. It doesn't mean it's not worth making the small steps that could build to something bigger. Yeah. I'm just going to imagine, though, that Eurydice is leading the underground. I have to tell myself these things, so I'm not just, like, really sad about the story.
we all have our coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
Mine was to listen to it on repeat for 2 months, so...
Granted, you were coping with something very particular during that period.
True.
Of time, so,
I was coping with a lot of things.
Yeah. Ugh. And that's why we started a podcast in August.
But so another aspect of this musical that I really like and would like to think more about, I don't know if necessarily now, but in general, is how it might also function as climate fiction.
That is really interesting. Could you say like a sentence or two more about that? Because I think I see where you're going, but also, yeah.
Well, because, so it's a little bit, it's both more and less on the nose than the, like, you should join your union message.
Stand together, beat the bosses.
Because part of the reason that things are wrong is that the seasons are out of joint. And that, like, it's too hot, it's too cold, this isn't working. And the reason it's not working is because Hades and Persephone's relationship isn't working. But part of the reason it's not working as well is because of the industrialization and the mining and the environmental threats, these things that are not natural, to use Persephone's words, in the underworld. So it this feeling of, like, the climate being wrong and not being able to, like, grow enough food and, like, like Eurydice is kind of like a climate refugee.
And it's funny because there's also then that sense of community as being what helps people to survive, right? Because when Eurydice goes off on her own to find food and is out in the wind again, that's when she's seduced by Hades and comes down to the underworld, right? So even braided into this kind of discussion of climate is, again, the discussion of community action and what's going to save us is coming together and working together, right?
And also sort of like thinking about that specific, what to me feels like a 1930s setting, but also like Appalachian. There's this feeling of like the Dust Bowl, sort of like, well, like when I think of the Depression, I think of the Dust Bowl, which was, you know, like caused in part by like farmers overusing the land, over farming, but then also like making the underworld not just like a place where people are unhappy, but like a factory where they're also mining, which like I then associate with coal
and building.
So it feels industrial.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. You know, when we talk about I was just watching something actually about the transformation of society from being like a bunch of artisans to being like industrialized people and working on assembly lines and all that kind of stuff. So anyhow, I think you're absolutely right that there is that connection that's being drawn to like the industrialization of society and how that has in turn led to perhaps some of the seasons being out of whack. Like today in March in New Jersey, I think the real feels 71 degrees.
Oh yeah, we're already in the 80s, and we've been in the 80s since February in Florida. Or in North Florida, and it's not supposed to be that way. It hasn't been that. I've only been here for 7 years.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's actually pretty odd.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I would like to sit and think about this a bit more. But I think you are absolutely onto something here. Like, this is the kind of thing that I'd want to go and like pull quotes or like look at scenes closely. Like the thing that I'm thinking about in particular is like, how do the fates factor into kind of like a climate reading of Hadestown, right? Because in a lot of ways they represent the wind, right? They also play a significant role in Hades' underworld factory, right? So I'm almost wondering how the fates are like wrapped up in all of that. So I'm glad you brought it up because I'm gonna be thinking about this for a little bit, even if I don't have something like concrete to say right now.
Yeah, since we haven't really dwelt on the fates that much because they're not super like central to the love story aspect that we're mostly focusing on. But I do want to I want to shout out the fates performances.
Oh, they were great. They were fantastic.
They were excellent in both versions that I saw. Like 10 out of 10, no notes.
And we also saw some understudy fates too in our performance. So shout out to the understudies as well. Like,
and one of the things that was really clear to me when seeing it performed, because like they have these really like lovely creepy harmonies that they sing, like when they have like their particular songs, but how threatening they were to Eurydice, and especially like how much they like harass her.
Yeah, they really too.
I get, like, seeing how much she's, like, harassed and, like, having her stuff stolen, losing her coat, losing her backpack, losing all of the food that she's spent, like, forever gathering, like, seeing her, how harassed she is, and how, like, there is the suggestion that she has been, like, a specific target of the fates from long before we meet her, makes me understand more why she made the decision that she did to accept Hades' offer.
Yeah, yeah. And then on top of that, the fates acting as doubt, right? When Orpheus is making his way back up to the overworld. Because they've already been established as such an antagonistic force to Eurydice.
Yeah.
The way they kind of, like... And I know we said the snake before was more metaphorical, but they're very serpentine to me when they're working their way through that sequence. It was really impactful. Like, I can almost understand that personification of doubt sneaking in and causing Orpheus to lose faith at that last moment. That sequence in particular, I remember you being kind of in awe of Orpheus's trek back up and how they were like, there was something on the stage that caused it to rotate, and then like Eurydice and the workers would come in sometimes, but sometimes it would be the fates that were behind him. That was really expertly staged, I think.
So for people who, I'm gonna describe it using, I'm sure, the wrong words, but there is like a turntable in the center of the stage that is part of how they get a lot of this kinetic motion and a lot of and a lot of the staging, because it can be turning and like these characters can be walking, and they can be like walking with it so that they're walking in the direction it's turning, so it makes it look like they're walking faster. They can be walking against it, or in the opposite direction, so it looks like they're walking, but they're walking in place. And they use that to great effect throughout the whole show, but particularly in the ending when Eurydice, so the workers are following Eurydice, who is following Orpheus, who has been told by Hades via Hermes that if he can lead Eurydice, they can't walk out of hell the way they planned, hand in hand and side by side and all of that, to quote the lyrics, because I just apparently have them on the top of my brain.
No shade, go ahead.
They've made this deal, but Orpheus never quite trusts it, and is afraid that it's a trick that's being played on him. And so the way they stage it is the theater is almost pitch black.
Yeah.
I think maybe Orpheus has a lantern.
Yes. There's like a light of some kind.
Yeah, he has like a functional like lantern, and they use like a fog machine, so it's also foggy, and it's so pitch black that like there are times when we see Orpheus making his way out of hell, that Eurydice is not there. She's not following him, and it's very much like it seems like a question of like, is she there? Is she not?
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm glad that you talked about that, because it was a great way to intertwine the doubt that Orpheus is feeling, but also getting an internal sense of that by having the fates there. But then just when you're like, is she really there? Then Eurydice and the other workers would pop back up. So you're kind of like cheering Orpheus along, knowing mentally what he is dealing with. And it just makes the moment when he turns back all the more devastating, because it's like, you've made it all this way, bro. But also, can I just say, I think it's bullshit that he made it out. He was out. He was out. And they said you can't look back while you're on the journey. He was out, but because he turned back around and sees her as she's stepping out, she gets to go back. That feels like a loophole, a bullshit loophole to me, because if I'm out the door, I'm out the door. You said I couldn't look while I was in the room, but I'm out the door now. So I just think that's a little,
you have a bone to pick with Hades.
I do, actually. I'm not going to go down there and see him. So, like,
no,
I can just complain to you. But I'm not trying to make no deals with Hades. So, like, it's fine. But I've always been a little upset about that, because it feels like
cheating.
He followed the rules. Yeah, exactly. So when we watched it, because I kind of want to take a moment to sort of dwell, I don't know, it might just make us sad again, but on that moment when like Orpheus turns around and it's like, it's you, and Eurydice says it's me, and then he seems like
they sing each other's names, and then Eurydice, like, they have, like, I don't know the right term for it again, but, like, a trap door sort of, like, in the center of the stage, so, like, she sinks down underneath the stage, and she is gone. Like, she's just, like, she's gone, just like that, and it is so sad.
It's devastating.
Like, the weight of that moment.
You just want to make me sad. What did you want to talk about? Did you?
I don't know. I just wanted to talk about how sad it is.
It's sad, Corinne. Yeah, because they really do, like, drop her away. There is no if, ands, or buts about it. It was like, well, bud, that's that. You look back, she's gone. And
I think both times I saw it, there were audible gasps in the audience. It's also a moment where they use silence really effectively.
Oh, yeah. I would agree. And, I mean, I think it's because, you know, the audience starts to hope that it can work, you know? So when it doesn't work, it's kind of like, fuck, you know? Most people are not going to scream fuck in the middle of a performance, right? So you get, like, audible gasps.
No one yelled fuck, but, like, when I saw it in Jacksonville, I think someone was, like, audibly, like, sobbing.
I mean, I was. You know?
I was crying, but I wasn't. I tried to keep the sound inside.
No, there are certain things that when I've seen it, the sound's going to come out. I'm just going to go, it's going to be what it is. But yeah, it's devastating. It's devastating, and they staged it devastatingly. Like, there are ways to do that to make it less, like, painful. But they were like, no, we're going to yank her through the floor. So, you know, you get the visual of her dropping down after doing all that fucking walking, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not even like she has to walk back. They're just like, nope, snatch it back. Now go to work. So, yeah, you just wanted to depress me at the end of the podcast. It's fine.
You're welcome.
So I guess as we're being sad, do you have any, like, last final things about Hadestown that we didn't get a chance to talk about? Any lingering thoughts as I wallow over here?
We've kind of mentioned it a couple of times, but I do want to, like, make note of how important the orchestra band is to the show.
They're great.
Like, they, especially because they are on stage the whole time. Oh, actually, that is something I do kind of want to mention, is that most of the cast is on stage most of the show. So even, like, in the beginning when Hades and Persephone, like, they're introduced by Hermes, but they're not in the action for a bit. They're sitting on this balcony, like, playing cards, like, talking to each other, like, reading the newspaper. Like, they're on stage, like, in view. There's a sense of them, like, just always being present, I think, in a really interesting way. And circling back to the band being really great, in particular, I didn't realize how important the bass trombone was to this, like, orchestra setting until I saw it, and I was like, oh, that bass trombonist is carrying it. Like, it was a man when I saw it in New York, and then a woman bass trombonist in the touring version, and, like, they were just phenomenal. Everyone was, but particularly, like, just shout out to the bass trombone man.
Yeah, no, the ensemble is great. They did the damn thing. I also appreciate that you're like, shout out to the bass trombonist in particular.
That's where my musical background comes out, like, a little bit.
Yeah, no, I know. If they ever listen to the podcast, I hope they feel a sense of pride at standing out.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, I wish that's something I would like to, like, if there was an orchestral version, which I know that's not how musicals work, but I would love to just, like, listen to the band.
I do love that there are a lot of really good, or at least a few really good, like, musical breaks.
Yeah.
And in specifically Our Lady of the Underground, I really love that Persephone introduces all of the band members by name to, like, sort of give them their flowers, which I think is really lovely.
No, I think that's really nice. It's another reason why I wish that there were, like, multiple versions of the cast recording so that the band could get shout outs in, like, the different versions of the cast recordings. But awesome. Oh, this has been such a good, robust discussion of Hadestown.
Yeah, It was nice to think about it deeply, especially since I've been like obsessed with it for so long.
Yeah, and I kind of appreciated that we were coming at it from different perspectives because that ultimately I think influenced how we intook the story. You know, because now there are some things now that I wasn't thinking about that based on our conversation are going to be rolling around in the back of my brain in a different kind of way. So this is awesome. Worth waiting for, I hope.
Third time's the charm.
Yeah, right. So since this is going to be our March episode, why don't we preview the folks with some other stuff that we have coming up later in the year?
Yeah, so we've mentioned it before, but we are, and in this episode,
Right.
we're working on a potential mini-series on divorce comedies. I'm currently in the middle of my rewatch of the Japanese drama Let's Get Divorced. That show is so charming.
It's so good.
For a show, like, about divorce, like, it's so funny. And, like, lovely. And then bittersweet. Anyway, we'll have thoughts about divorce comedy. That we will bring to you at a later date.
I just finished Strangers again on Viki, which also has a kind of bittersweet ending. We'll have a lot of feelings. So if you want to do your homework, divorce comedies, Dr. Cha, which is on Netflix, Let's Get Divorced, which is on Netflix, and Strangers Again, which is on Viki.
Yes.
We also are thinking of doing an episode on A Court of Thorns and Roses, which I just finished. I think we'll have some things to say about it.
Yeah, we will be entering the mass universe, I guess. But we're only so people who like are very much into like the Court series, we will not just start and stop with The Court of Thorns and Roses. We're gonna take it one book at a time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to cover in the first one, and I've only read one of them so far, and I will pick up the second one after I read a couple other things. I'm reading again. I'm really proud of myself. I've read 3 books this year.
Yeah, as a fantasy scholar, I have read the first 4 of the Court series. I haven't read the newest one that just came out, but so I have. This will be again a revisit for me, whereas Ayanni is coming at it with fresh eyes.
Yeah, so I'll have things to say, and I'm sure you'll have some things to say. So look forward to that episode coming up in the near future. So if people want to be kept abreast of the things that we are talking about on SLL and the other exciting things that we have going on, where should they find us on the great wide web, Corinne?
Yeah, so you can find us on Instagram at sexlovelit, all one word, or on Tumblr at sexlovelitpodcast.
Or you can email us, but don't do that. I'm kidding. Well, this has been a fantastic, if I do say so myself, episode of Sex, Love, Literature. We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.
What that face was, his ghost just made.
Oh, I heard it.
I
heard it. That was loud.
So that might stay in. We'll see what happens.